Recording in progress. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, there are a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for zero point 0.1 ASHA CEU. If you're joining us for this live episode and your state license requires live CEUs, be sure to complete all course modules, including the one that says complete course before the end of the day on your Speech Therapy PD account. Here are the disclosures. Jennifer Ruckner is co-founder of Tots to Teens Therapy Services. She sits on the foundation's first board of directors, the 2024 ASHA Convention Planning Committee for Pediatric Feeding and Swallowing, and the Prince William County Chamber of Commerce. I am the owner and founder of BrainBridge Connect LLC, and as the host of this podcast and other webinars on speech therapy PD, I do receive financial reimbursement. I'm also the secretary and president-elect of the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be placed in the chat or the Q&A tonight and will be answered throughout the presentation. Now we welcome our guest and my friend, Jennifer Ruckner, MS, CCC, SLP, who's a seasoned speech-language pathologist with over 3 decades of experience across early intervention, school districts, and private practice. She earned both her Bachelor of Science and Master's degrees in Communication Disorders from Auburn University and has been practicing since 1990. Jennifer specializes in social and pragmatic language, autism spectrum disorder, expressive language disorder, and feeding disorders. She's Beckman Oral Motor certified and provides services through telepractice and in-home visits. During her tenure with Stafford County Schools, she piloted a preschool expressive language program that expanded access to early communication support. In 2008, Jennifer co-founded Tots to Teens Therapy Services with partner Patty Minicucci, offering interdisciplinary speech and language resources to families throughout Northern Virginia. She also serves as a community ambassador for Feeding Matters, a parent-founded nonprofit dedicated to advancing care for children with pediatric feeding disorders. Jennifer's work reflects a lifelong commitment to empowering families and fostering meaningful communication at every stage of development. Jen, so good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad
Of
to be back.
Yes, yeah. So for those of you who may not have heard early episodes, we did an episode on season 1, so be sure to go and check that out. Um, so one thing we didn't talk about during that episode is your journey as a young person and how you came into the field of speech language pathology. So can you share with us what led you into this field?
Sure. So I started doing work with kiddos from when I was a kiddo. So I babysat, I did all kinds of things with kids, and that just definitely was a passion of mine. And I knew working with kids had to be a part of my life. And so that's kind of how it started. But I didn't really know a whole lot about speech pathology and decided to go into business. I figured, oh, I'll start, basically, I'll open a daycare center or a child care center. That was sort of what my thought process was when I went off to college. And so I started in business and I lasted about 2 years and decided, yeah, that really wasn't my thing. But I'm glad I did it because I think it's helped me in the long run. But anyway, I ended up then talking to an aunt of mine who was a speech language pathologist, but she lived, I was in on the East Coast, she lived on the West Coast, and so I didn't see her very often. So I got to kind of shadow her and see what she did over one of her sessions, and then I got to be with her a little bit more and got to see a little bit more, and I was like, oh, I think I could do this. I like this, thought process. So that's kind of what happened, and I ended up being lucky enough that the college Auburn that I went to actually had a communication disorders program, and so I then quickly changed my major over and ended up moving to speech pathology. and enjoyed it so much and stayed at Auburn and finished my degree there. And then my adventure began. So that's kind of how I got started.
Yeah, that's definitely an adventure from Auburn back up to Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
Um, well, and I think, couple of things that you and I have talked about, we're trying to increase ways that we could be um, present in our field without necessarily being constricted to only insurance-driven therapy. We have this opportunity to be educators as well, and so that sort of led you into a different path of becoming a, correct me if I say it incorrectly, neuroscience, is it neuroscience coach?
Yes. Yeah. And that, I deal with a lot of kiddos that sensory processing or, self-regulation is definitely an issue. And what it all stems back to, honestly, is the nervous system and how the
Yeah.
brain's working and all of this. And I thought, I already have a pretty good handle on a lot of that. So why am I not expanding my knowledge and just learning more about neuroscience in general? And so that's kind of what started me on this new path. And I realized when I started, um, like everybody could use this. It wasn't just our kids that we were working with. Like the parents could use it. I could use it. My own personal kids could use it, And so it's sort of just expanded to, what are those like everyday things that we could be doing that's going to improve our overall brain health? And so it's been a very fun new adventure that I don't think in this field, if you ever stop adventuring, there's probably something wrong, because there's always stuff that you can learn and keep growing.
Yeah, and I think, when we're thinking about you brought up a great point already, the brain health piece of things. We're looking at not only us as aging professionals, but our own watching our own kids, have kids and mature and have careers and things that take them into new realms of their daily routine. So what are 5 ways that your brain function health really needs to be increased to be effective in our daily routines?
So, when we're talking about our brain health, we really have to look at it from several different areas. And I like to say it's the three N's. So, your nervous system obviously is the biggest one, but there's neurochemicals that also impact a lot of our brain health as well. Like, are some of them too high or some of them too low? Because that's going to affect us as well. And then neuroplasticity, so, how are we making those connections and are we making good connections? Our brain doesn't know if those are good connections or bad connections, it just connects when we're doing something more regularly. So, thinking of those as we kind of talk about the five areas, there are a lot more than just these five. But when
Yeah.
we talk about these five, it's really the five biggest things that really do impact our brain health. And so, you know, sleep and rest, super critical for brain health. Being a postmenopausal woman, sleep has been a problem for me. And so, like, I can attest to the fact that brain fog is real when you don't sleep, and that all goes back to getting enough rest so that our brain can recharge at night. Another one is diet. Diet is critical. So many things that we're putting into our bodies nowadays are not the best choices, but a lot of times we don't even realize that some of those things are really hurting us and harming us. Then if you've watched any of the documentaries and things like that on plastics and things like that in our food supply, and so there's a lot of things that we can do and try to protect our brains from what we're putting and eating, drinking into our bodies. Exercise, that is also a very critical component. As I am aging, like you said, as we're aging, we're getting older. I can tell you when I'm not exercising, my body is kicking back at me and everything starts getting super stiff and, not nearly as agile as it used to be. Well, guess what? The brain is the same exact way as our body and our muscles. Um, Adding some kind of artistic activities, whether it's music or some kind of painting or writing, that creativity part is extremely important. And you can probably address this better than I, Renee, since you've worked with adults so long. But, in a lot of places that are treating aging clients, basically they're bringing a lot of the music and the artistic things back to in order to create some new synapses in that neuroplasticity in order for that brain to work better, especially in our dementia and Alzheimer's units. And then learning something new, having a hobby. You know, when we talked about sleep and rest at the beginning, having a hobby is part of that rest. Our body has time to turn, our brain has time to turn off so that we're able to kind of rest our brain. And doing a hobby is one of the best ways for us to do that. So those are just five. Like I said, there's tons more, but these are the five that you hear about that are pretty significant in that brain health.
Yeah, and so a lot of the things when I'm thinking, because like you said, I work with adults and you work mostly with peds, those first three especially are critical pieces for my brain injured clients, whether it's acquired brain injury or traumatic brain injury. Sleep is always a problem. Nutrition is often a problem. Knowing how much to push for exercise, having some sort of movement, that's always a question I get. Even if the person's working with physical therapy, because physical therapy is not the same thing as maybe their need to have that stress reliever for exercise,
Hmm.
that endorphin push, that dopamine loader, sleep in patients with brain injuries is disrupted, as I'm sure it is with our pediatric patients who are having a variety of disorders, whether it's autism, whether it's a feeding disorder is also highly integrated into all that. Those top three for me are things that I teach my patients and their families and caregivers all the time. But I love that you brought up artistic activities. One of the things that I found that initially I was, because we had this kind of conflict going on within our field and music therapists, right? We had some overlap within our own state. And there was a lot of things that we were hearing that were making me like, I don't want to work with them and stay away from my patient. But what I found was with my patients with aphasia, having that complement of music therapy often helped them be more fluent, um, more engaged. It was tapping into a different thing than I was tapping into. So it was definitely a complementary therapy when we were working, uh, like kind of side by side, next, not in the same room, but next to each other. So it was complementary therapies on both sides of the coin. Um, so what have you seen that with your kiddos? Do you work with music therapists or with other? I know we always work with PT and OT and
Right.
sometimes rec therapy, depending on where you're at, what setting you're in.
Hmm. We don't have any music therapists that I'm aware of right in our immediate area. I'm sure that they are here and, are doing great things. Basically, we do use a lot of music. We use a
Mhm.
lot of, art using that fine motor. There's a lot of brain connectivity that which I think is really interesting because you and I are from the age where, we use typewriters and we hand wrote most everything, whether it was cursive or print or whatever. And so there's a lot of correlation with that act of using
Oh, you're learning.
printing. Yes. And so we use a lot of that as well because that's creating a different neural pathway than what using a computer or iPad or something like that would use. And that's what a lot of our kids are now doing,
Hmm.
is using a lot of, so they're not forming some of those really good brain connectivities that are actually have now been proven to show that the act of writing itself is actually improving brain function, which is,
Hmm.
I think, fascinating. So, journaling and, writing of any kind, whether it's just, writing a letter or something like that, that also goes to connectivity, which I didn't bring up, but that's also a big thing. Connecting with other people is also so good for brain health and as well. So,
Yeah, no, and I love the writing because I'm sitting here writing notes as we're talking, and I do that quite frequently because it helps me. And one thing that I explain to people, and I've probably said it on the podcast before, is when you make a list or like you mentioned, journaling, it helps you engage in a different way. So, like making a grocery list, for example, helps you reinforce that maybe you won't need to look at everything on there, but it'll help you remember that one thing that you're not getting, that you're
mhm,
kind of stuck on, that you won't remember if you rely on your brain to remember those four things you needed, and you remember that fourth one when you've bought weird stuff and you pull in your driveway. That's when you remember it. So if we
mhm,
just do the simple act of writing it down, that tends to lend us to success, right? We're setting ourselves up for success. Um, One thing you mentioned with journaling, I've seen this a couple of different ways. Worked with an organization and did a summit back in April, and one of the things that the athletic trainers were talking about was having their clients they were working with do journaling as part of their therapy. So they were athletic trainers who worked a lot with people with athletes with concussion of all ages. And
mhm,
so they're having them journal like how they were feeling. What were your triggers that day? Was it light? Was it noise? Was it kind of get the example. But another one I've heard, and I've actually used it with a couple of recent clients, was success journaling. So often, for our adult patients or even our teenage patients, they tend to be very self-critical if they're aware of their errors and they're aware of their deficits. And so having them point out 1 to 3 things a day and write it down of this was successful, no matter how simple it is, no
mhm,
matter how complex it is. It could be, I remembered to feed the dog, or I felt good about taking a walk to the end of the block and back, whatever it is, having that success journal that they can go back in 6 weeks or 6 months into their therapy when their therapy's done and look back at it and go, oh my gosh, this is where I was at
mhm.
in month one, and now I'm in month six, and this is what I've been able to accomplish. It seems like such a small menial thing, but it really isn't, because all those successes build up and help build that confidence in our patients that they really, really need.
Well, and what's interesting, you talking about that, like it not only builds confidence, but also what it's doing, it's creating a new pathway because
Yeah.
when they're being critical of themselves, then your brain is being triggered it's always looking for that critical thing. So the
Mm-hmm.
more you do it, that's that neuroplasticity. The more you're doing it, the more that's going to happen. But when you change it and then you start thinking about those positives, the gratitude and positive talk and things like that, then that becomes your new uh, neuro connection. And so then your brain is like looking for all the good things. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really a cool, like, all of that is so cool when you think about how the brain actually works. Because, like I said earlier, your brain doesn't know if this is a good neural pathway or not, it's just doing what you're telling it to do all the time. So, if
Right.
you're telling it to look for good things, it's going to look for good things. But when you're, you know, being critical of yourself, then that's what it's also looking for. And I just read a bit of research the other day that was on people who are critical of themselves. Actually, their productivity is worse than when they are looking at the good things that they're doing. Their success rate and productivity increases. So right there, you got to be kind to yourself because you're going to do better if you're thinking better of what you're doing. So, um,
Huh. Well, that makes sense when you decrease the workload stress and have a better work-life balance, which is really hard for a lot of people. I mean, we know it's crazy out there in the streets now with insurance and productivity when you work in healthcare and what the expectations are. And I was reading I'm in a medical SLP Facebook group, and I was reading some of the questions tonight about expectations for how many instrumental exams are being demanded in one day.
Mhm.
um, and it's so challenging when you're in that space and you're being told to do XYZ and you feel like you can't advocate for yourself and you do get caught up in that. It becomes this like negative circle, and then you sort of become like, okay, I'm going to do this because this is the expectation. And the minute you break free from that cycle, and you're able to have someone that supports you at work, that's advocating for you as well, and saying, you're not gonna abuse my employee like that. This is not a safe space. This is not creating a safe environment. The minute that happens, or you're able to do that for yourself, your stress, like it just changes everything, and your sleep improves and you feel better and you don't feel so bogged down and drained. Um, but that also leads me back to nutrition, because we do have a question in the
Uh-huh.
chat. Do you consider maintaining adequate hydration as part of diet? And I'll be quiet. I'll let you answer that because I know my answer.
Yes, 100%. Yes, 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 yes. Hydration is critical for brain health because our brain is made up 80% of water. That's a lot of, the bulk of our brain is water. So, kind of the guidelines, and this can vary a lot, depending on the resources that you're looking at, but typically the amount that we should be drinking water wise is no less than 50 ounces, 50 ounces of water a day. However, there's other research out there, and obviously, there's certain health conditions out there that, if you have them and water is an issue, you need to talk to your doctor. But for most people, this is not a problem. So, but you, like, if you're 120 pounds, then you should be drinking half in ounces of that. So you should be drinking 60 ounces of water a day. So I have, my husband calls them the big dumb cups because they're the big, drink. And I'm drinking at least two of those every single day. And he's like, why do you drink that much? And I'm like, because it's good for my brain, And so, but that is definitely, hydration is definitely a thing. And then really cool research that came out of Harvard with, I believe it was with 35,000 people, and it was over an extended period of time, like 20 plus years. And the cool thing was they were checking to see if the chance of dementia decreased with coffee drinkers. And so what they found was that if you are drinking between 2 and 3 cups of coffee a day, that you decreased your chance of dementia by 35%. So for you guys who are coffee drinkers like me, that's really good news because that, I love my coffee. But also they also found the same correlation. 1 to 2 cups of tea, caffeinated tea, gave the same results. So tea drinkers, but it has to be caffeinated, and this does not include sodas and things like that. Only coffee and teas. But what great information. But that's not to replace the water. We still
Hmm.
have to have that water on top of, the coffee. But I thought that was pretty cool to find out, because now I have a reason to keep my coffee intake up.
Well, and I think the water too, we think about for those of us who work with adults, our geriatric patients who come in dehydrated or they come in with um, issues with their potassium or sodium being too high or too low, and they're often, again, dehydrated. Those are patients who are experiencing high frequency UTIs. They are confused as a result of that. So that's a really important point to make when it comes to brain health. And then the coffee and tea, if you look at, and I love thinking about this in these terms. So you brought up nutrition, like some of the plastics in food, but like the blue zones, if you haven't heard of the
Mhm.
blue zones, there's some really good, um, if you like being like, just going all in on Netflix or like a documentary. There's some really good documentaries
Yeah.
about blue zones. So those places like Japan, there's some areas, Sardinia in Italy, there's
Mhm.
some other ones. I'm not naming all of them, of course, but they have certain things in common. In most societies, they have coffee or tea
Mhm.
as part of their staple in their diet, but they are also doing the same things. They're hydrating. They are also walking. They have
Yep.
very walkable cities. They have walkable spaces. We know that some Asian places they do like Tai Chi, for example, in the morning. It's a daily routine. It's part of what they do every day. There's yoga in other parts of the world. There's all these things that we know are combination things throughout the world and throughout time. Like this is not new stuff, right?
Mhm.
Yoga is not new. Tai Chi is not new. Drinking water is not new. We were looking at aqueducts for garden and things like that in ancient times in different places. So we know that water's been a foundational thing. Um, Coffee and tea is a foundational thing for a lot of societies. So it's interesting to see that people come up with this now like it's a brand new thing. It's not a brand new thing. This is proven over hundreds and thousands of years that societies who have the highest longevity and the highest life expectancies are doing these things.
Mhm.
Sleep, hydration, nutrition, as part of that, nutrition, exercise. You mentioned socialization as well. I love the learning something new or the hobby. We
Mhm.
see a lot of our assisted living facilities where patients are still somewhat independent, or they often will have an independent living side. A lot of those patients are doing things like mahjong, they're knitting, they're playing bingo. And it sounds like old people hokey pokey or whatever. But it's really not. It's, social connection. It's engaging your brain in a different way. It's learning a new skill. Mahjong is the American version of Mahjong. I don't play, but I have some friends who do. Learning the rules. The sensory feel of the tiles, the colors. There's a lot of engaging things like that that we I think, discount and don't realize that that's what we're doing. But we're teaching these similar things to our patients all the time, but we're not giving ourselves that grace in allowing ourselves to do the same thing that we're teaching our patients for our own longevity. And I think that's part of what we wanted to cover tonight and make sure that we said, why are we not doing this for ourselves?
Right, because being in pediatrics, I mean, I constantly tell parents, if you can't be the best version of you, you can't be there for your kid. But yet,
Hmm.
us as therapists, are we not doing kind of the same exact thing? So I love that you said that, because a lot of these things are not things that are difficult to do. it's just changing some habits that we have, changing our, routines, and they're all going to be good for us in the long run, and I think a lot of times people start thinking about this when they get in their 50s, but really where the sweet spot is in the late 30s and 40s. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the sweet spot. But a lot of people aren't starting to think about that until they get to be in their 50s. And so I think, especially with a high, our rate of going is nonstop in our field. And so being able to take time for us is going to be super important, for that longevity for ourselves too. So we kind of have to practice what we preach a little bit, I think.
Well, it's been nice I had one of my former colleagues, dietitian friend, on, and she talked about the connection between gut brain health, but she's a really good resource for nutrition and always has been for me. And it's so funny because you probably know this about me, but I've always been for a very long time in plant-based. And so explaining that to people is so funny because they're always like, so you don't eat meat? How do you get protein? And I'm always like, it's very easy. There's a lot of protein and a lot of vegetables, and there's tofu and there's other things. And it's so funny because I was at a birthday party for my husband's best friend a couple weekends ago, and I ordered salmon, and the one lady was like, I thought you didn't eat meat. And I'm like, well, it's salmon. And she's like, that's meat. And I'm like, it's not. It's trying to explain that to people and how you can incorporate, protein that's healthy, that's not necessarily a beef or pork or a chicken, is so funny to me. It's so funny to me because I've been doing this for so long. It started when my son was in middle school, and I won't say how old he is, but that was a long time ago. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. But then thinking about too how that interacts with the neurochemicals in our brain. And that was one of the questions I wanted to talk about was those neurochemicals. We have a lot. I mentioned dopamine earlier. I mentioned um, something else when I felt really smart earlier. But thinking about neurochemicals and the impact on our brain function, how do we know kind of how those neurochemicals are impacting our brain function? What do we know about that?
So we know that, like I said, it really varies. A lot of times, what's happening when they're out of whack, whether it's too much or too low, typically, if you go to a doctor, what they're going to do is prescribe you some kind of medication to get it back in line. But
Hmm.
there's so many things that we can do that are basically everyday type things that will help kind of restructure that neurochemical. I'm not saying everybody can do this and it's going to take, they're going to be able to go off medication. But I think that we kind of live in that society where a lot of times we look at what is happening and we don't always dive deep to see what the problem is. And so when we look at, there's four, what we call the four pillars of happiness, with four really big neurochemicals. One's dopamine. And when we look at dopamine, basically what that is like it's what creates motivation and reward. So
Hmm.
that's going to keep us motivated. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things that are just everyday things that you do that are a dopamine rush. So doing a task. I had read something that if you just make your bed in the morning,
Yeah,
that gives you a rush of dopamine because that's motivation.
accomplish
You
something.
just did
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool, that just making your bed. I still haven't convinced my husband of this one, so I need to work on that. But anyway, that's a rush of dopamine. Also, cleaning like your closet out or cleaning a small space out. Like that also gives you a rush of dopamine.
Hmm.
Um, Being able, you were talking about like the checklist. being able to cross those things off your checklist, that gives you a rush of dopamine. So it all goes back to what that motivation is and what that reward is that you're getting. And your brain will then trigger that dopamine rush, which then helps you to be able to function better. Another one of the big pillars is serotonin. And
Yeah.
serotonin is, related to mood and well-being, things like that. So when we look at serotonin, the natural serotonin you can get from just being outside. Anything
Hmm.
that you do outside, whether it's just sitting in the sun, listening to like the birds sing, all of that outside, when you think about just being in nature,
Hmm.
gives you those bursts of serotonin, which is awesome because that's my favorite. I love that.
Me too.
And it does improve my mood.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. And being in green space, what a lot of people don't realize is being in green space actually is like 15 minutes of green space is like giving you a shot of Ritalin, like a pill of Ritalin, which
It's a vitamin D boost. Yeah.
exactly. And so it's awesome to be able to just be able to get outside. So like a lot of times some practical things that we do at work is we'll do like a walking meeting outside. So if I'm meeting with a couple of people, we might just I'll say, "Okay, let's get our, let's go outside and walk around." Not right now because it's blistering hot, but in the spring and fall, we usually will do like a walk because it's such a great mood booster for everybody. Another one is oxytocin. And so when we look at oxytocin, we're looking at connection and that bonding piece. So we were talking about that earlier. So anything you do to connect with others, maybe call a friend, might be, giving somebody a compliment or, my favorite is loving on my animals, my dogs, and loving on them. So that's that oxytocin that really will boost that neurochemical. And then endorphins, which we hear a lot about endorphins because of the exercise component, because, people think about runners and getting the runner's high and things like that. But what people don't really always know about endorphins is that, it helps with pain relief. And it's
Hmm.
also a mood booster. That's why when runners get that runner's high, it really is, it boosts their mood. And after they get done with it, they feel much better. So,
Yeah.
some practical things if you work in a building that has stairs instead of taking the elevator, taking the stairs, doing something that's going to get your endorphins going, usually some kind of movement. My favorite is dancing at random times, doing silly things. I love it. Or doing, some kind of Zumba or something like that. And this is where that exercise piece comes in, picking a sport that you really like. And there's a lot of research on like it's some people go to the gym and they absolutely hate it. Well, that's still good for you. But the real truth is, if you're enjoying the sport or the activity that you're doing while exercising, it actually is even better for your brain and your brain health because it's creating that, like the endorphins, it's giving you that mood boost. So it's giving you that extra umph that you need, that if you aren't enjoying it maybe as much, you won't get the full benefits of. So if you're looking for something to do, that's a sport or whatever, pick something that you really enjoy doing so that you get that double dose of enjoyment and the endorphins going.
Well, and two, if you're enjoying it, you're more likely to continue doing it. Because if
That
you
too.
hate it, you're not going to be motivated. And I think, again, that's one of those things that was a push for a lot of bigger corporations when they were designing these employee wellness programs that were part of their benefit package. And so one of those is, of course, Google is famous for their workspaces.
Hmm.
Um, my daughter, when she worked for a mortgage company locally that they did some interesting things. They had like a meditation room there. They had this program where um, they had a vending machine, but it wasn't vending like Fritos and Coke. It was like fancy granolas and different healthier options. And what they would do is go around every week and they would give tokens during staff meetings, and you could accumulate like so many tokens. So you used your tokens, not actual cash, to get these healthier options like nut bags of nuts or trail mix or whatever. And so that was kind of interesting when I went to see her at her office. This was like one of her earlier jobs, and to see how they were incorporating wellness. My son's one of his earlier jobs. They had gym membership was one of the benefits
Hmm.
that they, and that was in Northern Virginia where they do a lot of companies up there to tend to do that. They'll have green spaces as well, where like one of the places, I think it was the same place my daughter worked at that had all the other stuff. They had a trail behind their office where you could it looked like a nature trail, and it had, it was in the city, but it was wooded behind their office building, and so they built a trail back there for the employees to be able to go and have this sort of like Zen experience, if you will, in the middle of the day, or they could, do that on their lunch break or sit outside and eat. And you see that in places where um, the company's known for supporting their employees and trying to have a mindfulness space, if you want to call it that, or whatever, because it does make a difference in the productivity of your day. We need to tell the health system that, because our productivity being at, where I worked was 100%, and we didn't have time to go outside. We barely had time to go to the bathroom because they were tracking you to see how many
Exactly.
times you went to the bathroom. So,
Well,
um, it
yeah,
helps people just feel better. And that early, like you mentioned, the early
mhm,
morning light too. That's like the best way to also balance your circadian rhythm that helps you with your sleep.
exactly. Well, and there's, you were talking about the benefits, with the productivity, but it's even more than that. People, when they're doing things that are helping their staff like that, with having outdoor space and things like that, they're also creating more employee retention. And, as
Hmm.
somebody who owns a company, that's pretty critical to the bottom line a lot of times, because it's not cheap to have to replace somebody all the time and retrain and all of those things. But
Hmm.
also, another thing, having common spaces like that, you also encourage more collaboration between, the people that work there, which is also good because they're forming those connections for both professional, but a lot of times even for personal things. We have a lot of young employees that work for us, and, we have one big conference room where they like to gather for lunch, and then they talk about, going to a concert together or doing stuff together. So that's, creating that collaboration, which is also really a good benefit. And then, of course, if you're taking care of yourself, then you're probably not going to get as sick as, you normally would too. So it's also a benefit that for the companies, for healthcare, they're not having to, you know, have somebody gone for illnesses as much and things like that. So there's a lot of,
Yeah.
benefits to companies thinking in those terms because it is going to end up being a direct result to the employees.
Yeah, no, and that's good, because thinking about coming up on the fall and winter months when people tend to be
Mhm.
more enclosed in spaces, if they're not as healthy when it comes to sleep, nutrition, activity, things like that, they may be more prone to illnesses. Um, you know, Again, you're working with kids who are also little germ magnets.
Yep.
I was in healthcare. Um, my immune system was probably the most stellar it's ever been from being constantly exposed to gosh knows what on a daily basis. And so I had to make sure that um, my nutrition was good. I was a runner, so I get the whole thing with endorphin and the runner's high. Um, but finding the connections there of making, if this is something that's new to you and you're trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I incorporate things like this? It's always the same when we're talking to our patients or our patients' families. It's picking a couple of things, right? Picking a couple of things that you can stick with to start, and then you can continue to add on. But if you try to change 4 to 5 things at one time that are huge, you're not setting yourself up for success the same way you wouldn't be setting your patient up for success if you went in and said, here's your entire 6 weeks of treatment plan, do that by tomorrow. It's not going to work. It's the same thing for us as practitioners and the way that we're approaching it with our patients, our clients, and their extended caregiving team. We've got to pick those things that we know are going to be manageable. We're implement if it's one change starts the ball rolling, right? It helps you keep motivated if it's like you mentioned something that you enjoy. But making that commitment to doing it, making it part of your routine. I'm when my kids were still at home and even when they went off to college, I was trying to figure out how to maintain life changes. Like when I would get off work, when I first started in the SLP world, I wasn't getting home from work until after 5. It was hard to work out because I'm not a morning worker outer. I never have been. So trying to figure out, where do I fit this into my day?
Hmm.
Because if you have it in your routine, you're more likely to continue doing that than you would be if it's like, okay, today I'm going to work out at 8 a.m. Tomorrow it's going to be 2:30, and then tomorrow it might be 4. For me, that would never work because I need that routine of where it fits in at that consistent time frame. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right. I think that just choosing one or two things at first is super important. I mentioned the neuroplastics earlier, and I had watched the Netflix documentary on that, and it was very overwhelming. And I'm
Yeah.
watching this, and I think this is true of any change. You watch it, and you're like, oh my goodness, that's so many things. And so I ended up deciding, okay, I'm going to change a couple of things. So I had some, cutting boards that, were had some plastics in it. And I said, nope, I'm going all bamboo. And so I bought all bamboo. And then then I did something else. And so it's really the same type thing. You just want to take a little bit at a time, and it, like we were talking about earlier, once you start doing it, it becomes a new connection that your brain is doing to where your brain then is looking for that, and it needs that, especially for exercise, because your brain, once you start exercising and your body and is used to getting that burst of serotonin, I mean endorphins, sorry, at the burst of endorphins, then all of a sudden your body's like, hey, wait, you didn't give me that today. I really need that. So go do whatever you were doing before. So it's, people, you know, become kind of addicted in some ways because that's your brain getting what it needs or what it wants. And it gets used to that. And so, just doing one little thing at a time is really good. And same for learning something new. Like you were talking about Mahjong. Like I would love to learn how to play. I have played once. I also learned how to, I've played a couple of times of pickleball, but I haven't really stuck to it. So like I wouldn't say that I've learned something new because I haven't really continued. So continuing something that you enjoy and learning that new skill creates those new neuro connections, and then that's going to help you to continue because it's giving you that fresh um, thought process, new
Hmm.
problem solving, new kinds, like you were saying, even just the feel of things. It's giving you a new experience, which then creates a different neuropathway, and so it's a whole litany of things that happen when we learn something new. Or even, you could combine a couple of those. You could do something new and learn something, maybe a new instrument or something like that. So then you're getting a double dose of, that music and that creativity piece with a new skill. So you could be, adding even more to your brain to help it.
Well, and it's also interesting, and I've talked about this probably many episodes ago, but I've had so many patients who would come in and say, um, this before I had my stroke, I used to play chess, or I really like, like whatever particular board game it is that they want to play with their grandkids or their kids, or they had a community group where they lived, that played, whether it was chess or, um, there were a couple who played Scrabble. They had like a Scrabble league. I didn't even know that was a thing. I would win that, by the way. But my one patient who, he played chess, and that was something that was really important to him. I don't play chess, but he taught me. So that was one of our therapy activities, was for him as a patient with aphasia to, teach me the rules of some of the, not all of them, but some of the rules of chess, so that I went to the dollar store and I got a really cheap chessboard, and he's like naming the pieces and telling me the basic moves. And then after doing this for several sessions, and we had a chess match, and of course he beat me in like 3 moves or something ridiculous. But the point is, it was teaching me something, but it was also very therapeutic for him because it was a goal. He
Mhm.
wanted to be able to get back to, going to the, recreation center where he lived, and picking up a chess match with, as he called them, the old guys, because this guy was like 40. And he would go to the rec center where he lived and volunteer prior to his stroke. But that, again, there's so many connections like that that we don't think about
Mhm.
on a day-to-day basis, that not only is it something that we could be doing as our own brain health, but we're engaging with our patients, and so many things that are so important to them that seem like it might not be that big of a deal is a huge deal, because for him that was social connection. It was rule based. It was him having to come up with the language to say this is what you should have done instead of what you did, and teaching me how to play. So there's a lot of, so many pieces of that that are crucial for, like you said, those new neural pathways for our patients too. It's not just, for us as practitioners and as humans.
Mhm. I think that's what I like the most about what I've been learning through this new little journey that I've been on is that, we are so intricately, you know what I'm saying, made that everything has a function. And
Yeah.
when we're learning things, like there's a whole series of things that we have to go through. And the way that we do it can be very, beneficial for us in a lot of ways. And so it's kind of like you said, this is not new. It's just that now we have better ways to like learn about it. But
Hmm.
this has been around since there have been humans. And so it's really cool when you can put those dots together and see how, when somebody has a stroke, how that does impact their brain and their brain functioning, and what we can do to perhaps help increase brain function then. It's just really, I don't know. I find it very fascinating and very, it just goes right into what we do every single day. And and we can use it for everybody we come in contact with, including ourselves.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking about, you working with the pediatric population, specifically like early intervention. How does this play into your early intervention patients? Because I think as speech language pathologists and SLPAs, we kind of tend to segment like what population, that age group that we're working with. But one of the things, I had a professor in graduate school who would say, I know you want to work with adults, but I want you to think about how does this translate if you did work with kids? What are the correlates between these two different populations and how that all goes back to the foundations of what we know as communication science professionals? Because I think that's sometimes the piece that's missing is we get in this box of, oh, I work with adults and oh, I work with kids. But a lot of that is translatable. So what do you see the benefits of brain health being with your littles? Because early intervention is not, 6-year-olds. It's like 2, 3 earlier ages.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, what's really cool is that birth to 5 is when the largest amount of brain growth is happening. So by the time they are 5, 90% of the brain has is grown. That's the biggest growth. But the biggest, even bigger, is between birth to 3. That
Yeah.
is like the 80% of the brain has grown by the age of 3. And, being a fairly new grandma, my grandbaby's not quite 2 yet, but she's almost there. And I have been able, I mean, it's a lot different. I've worked with littles for a long, long time, but it's so different when it's your own grandbaby that you're watching and you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is what we're talking about." Like that child is learning something and she's not local, so I have to do FaceTime and all of that. And every time that I see her, she's learned something new, and every time is something different. And so that's what's super, super cool about working with the littles is all of these things are happening, but they're happening so quickly because their brain is just growing so fast. So I love that. And the neuroplasticity part that we were talking about before is so much greater during this time. That's when they're like, I wish I had there's a cool visual of neuro pathways at age at different ages in that
Mm-hmm.
first 2 years. And so at 0, when they're first born, you see just a few little neuro pathways like sticking out, and not really many connections at all. And then it goes to like 3 months and you're starting to see more. And then they start to kind of touch. And then you get to 6 months and then they're really starting to intertwine. And then and it just keeps getting more and more. And then by the time they're 2, like it's like crazy. Like you can't really define them separately anymore because they're starting to really intertwine. So, a lot of people think that, well, because they do all this growth when they're little, like, when we get to be older, we just don't have that much, ability to do that. But that's really false. It does take us longer, but
Mm-hmm.
neuroplasticity happens at all ages. It never stops as long as you are, trying to connect new pathways. And that's by doing all of these things that we were talking about, learning a new thing and the music and different things like that can really help to continue to changing habits.
Mm-hmm.
That can create that's what having a new habit is creating a new pathway. So but yeah, so I use it a lot with my little ones because that's why learning a second language being a dual language kiddo is super important while they're little because they're like sponges and they're just constantly just soaking it all in. And so, we have a lot of dual language families where we are. And so I'm always encouraging them because they'll say, "Oh, I'm just worried that they're not going to talk and blah, blah." I'm like, no, don't stop. Keep it up because this is when they're going to learn those dual languages the most efficient is during this time period because their little brain is just soaking it all in. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we do a lot with brain health, even as itty bitties, because their whole life is nothing but brain health, right? That's when they're doing the most. And so, talking to families about diet, super critical. A lot of our kiddos, if they're not sleeping, like you mentioned before, a lot of our autistic population just they don't sleep, and you can see how it does impact learning, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's super important because when you're talking about these synapses connecting, a lot of that is with typically developing children and not thinking about people with, specific genetic disorders and things like that, because that could be a whole different podcast in and of itself. But I think the overarching thing is that all of these pieces, whether there is a diagnosis or not, you might have a kid with a language delay, or like for me, a patient with aphasia that's an acquired language disorder. That's very different than, someone who's typically developed, who's gone through their normal schooling, if it's just through high school, or if they've been able to go on to, furthering their education. You're going to see different vocabulary, but you're also going to see different abilities, right? And I think that, again, is that overarching theme of how are we nurturing that and how are we supporting that and as therapists, as clinicians, as speech language pathologists and SLPAs, but in our communities, we have a responsibility to help with that education because it's so lacking.
Mhm.
Um, we did have a question that says, can you share info where to find that study? I think they're talking about the where you see the uh brain connections, the neural connections from birth to two.
Yes, I will have to see if I have that handy.
Yeah, we can
But
put it in the show notes when the
Okay,
podcast is
perfect.
released. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, there's the group that I've worked with on the board, Foundation First. It's all geared around trying to get the best child care for kiddos birth to 5 in the state of Virginia, where we live, and this is one of the big things that we talk to, like you said, educating the community, talking about that brain growth and why it's so important that we do provide the best childcare for our kids, because this is the critical time,
Mm.
before they get to school. This is a critical time for them and brain growth. So yes, I will definitely get that for you.
Well, and I'll add this last little part because we need to be wrapping up. But when someone mentioned the adequate hydration, we know with our, and I'm not a voice clinician, I have had voice patients that were mostly there for their, something like LPR related to dysphagia. Um, they, one of the things when we teach, um, voice basics is adequate hydration. So making sure those patients that are coming to you with maybe they have some signs and symptoms of dysphagia that are reflux related, they're making sure they have adequate hydration. We know as people who use our voice constantly, we need to have adequate hydration when we go speak, or just in general, we're using our voices as clinicians all day for the most part. So we need to have adequate hydration or our voice suffers as a result. So I think that was one of the points I wanted to make. And then we have one last thing. I would appreciate knowing a recommended website resource for brain health strategies.
So, Dr. Mark Hyman, he
Yes.
has a lot of good information out there, especially with neurochemicals. So
Mm-hmm.
that would be a good somebody that I would recommend. There's also if you oh what Substack, if you go to Substack, there's a lot of great information that that's an app that you can go to, and if you can choose what subjects that you're interested in, and if you put in neuroscience or things related to that, a lot of great information comes from that. Um, uh, Good Neuroscience is another, and that's Good Neuroscience at Good Neuroscience on Instagram. Puts a lot of great information out there as well. So, um, and real practical type things that are easy to utilize. So that's another good thing that you can. Those are some of the ones that just come to me quickly.
Yeah, and I typed those in the chat, and I also added Dr. William Lee, who does a lot with
Mhm.
talking about food for brain health and food for gut health as well, because we know that the brain and gut are connected. Um, but we are at time. So I just want to say thank you so much, Jen, for sharing all this with us. I always love talking about brain stuff. I mean, brainstorms, the title. It's in the title. But I appreciate you so much for coming on and providing us with these resources. And we'll add that to the show notes as well. But just if you have joined us for the live episode and you need your state license requires you to have those live CEUs, make sure that you complete all